So I talked about attribution. I said, you always want to give attribution for any information you get. What attribution usually does is you usually want to say so and so said something. And, if you wrote it, then you can say stated, or you can say, wrote in an email. You can tell where they said it. But usually you want to always have the name, first and last name, the first time you introduce the person. So if the first time you would introduce me, you would say, said Timothy McKenzie. After that, you can use just last name. You don't use the first name. They're not your friend. They're not your buddy. You use the last name. The other question sometimes comes up, people want to use like Mr. McKenzie or Professor McKenzie over and over again. In journalism, we don't really use courtesy titles. We don't say Mr. So-and-so or Professor so-and-so. Even like if I had my doctorate, you wouldn't call me Dr. McKenzie because I'm not a medical doctor. We have kind of a preference that only medical doctors, dentists, maybe optometrists we can call doctor. But we don't use, like, if you're a professor and you have a PhD, we do not call you a doctor. And as much as that maybe maybe as an academic might bother me, the reality is the reason we don't do it is because it doesn't bother me, but it's just because most people associate, if somebody's a doctor, they think of a medical doctor or some kind of professional in that regard, not that they're a doctorate of education or engineering or anything else. So first reference, you would use that as part of a titling for the person, but after that you wouldn't use it. So you always use first and last name, and then you give some sort of description of who they are. So said Timothy McKenzie. If this is a story about something about Lincoln Land or about philosophy or journalism, you'd say said Timothy McKenzie, professor of journalism and humanities at Lincoln Land Community College. You'd want to give my job title and my location of work. And it can be a little cumbersome, but at least lets people know where the person works, lets you know why you're trusting them, things like that. Now, on the other hand, if you're doing a story about me going to a concert or a baseball game, and maybe there's it's postseason, you're wanting to get opinions on who the best team is and who's going to win the World Series, and you're talking to people on the streets, then you might say said Timothy McKenzie, and you might say a blank fan, a fan of the Cardinals or a fan of this, or said Timothy McKenzie of Decatur or something like that, right? You'd give maybe my location. You might give my age, things like that. Age you would introduce only if, it's maybe relevant. The fact that I'm, 25, 40 maybe. The fact that I'm that aged is not as important as is not important unless unless there's something important about it. Maybe like if I've died or I've ascended to some great position or something. But if I'm just talking about baseball, I don't think my age really matters. You would maybe want to attribute my name. You want to maybe say where I'm from or what my team affiliation is, something like what team I root for, things like that. But you just kind of want to introduce who they are. That way you know why we should even care what this person is saying, who they are, so that people can kind of, at least connect the dots. And so you always want to have the name, full name on the first reference. After that, you use the last name, never the first name. You don't use courtesy titles. There are exceptions with courtesy titles. New York Times and a few other publications will use courtesy titles when a person is deceased. And so they will say if, Mr. Smith said, Mrs. Smith said, Ms. Smith, Dr. Smith, things like that on second reference. The only time that becomes weird is when they sometimes are covering things like, Mr. McVeigh, they're maybe using things like that for people who killed people, like Timothy McVeigh, the guy who bombed the Oklahoma City bombing, man who was put to death for that. That would be kind of maybe some exceptions to that. But that's not AP style. That's just the style of certain publications. But you always want to give the full attribution. As long as we're talking about how you put in attribution, why that's important. Attribution is a little bit different if you're writing for, instead of print, if you're writing for radio or TV. In those, because in print formats or in written formats, people are able to read the paragraph and they're able to kind of connect the facts at the beginning with the attribution at the end. In TV and radio, because you're now saying things these people are saying, you usually want to introduce the people saying it first because of just the way people's brains work. There you're actually reading it to them versus them reading it and putting that information together on their own. And so in that format, you always start off with attribution up front where you would say, Timothy McKenzie, a professor at Lincoln Land, and you might shorten down those attributions a little bit for radio and TV, because people don't necessarily want to hear, Vice President of Accountability and Research and blah 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 for John Smith Corporation of Greater, by the time you've made this 15-second statement about what their title is, people are like, what, right? So you don't want to give too much in print, in written, or in radio and other things. It can be longer. In print, the benefit is you can kind of just throw those things out there, and people will skim it, and they'll be like, I don't care what their title is, but I can find it if I want it. It's all part of the citation, and that's why it's there. Always have it, always do that, and it makes it clear about who is the one actually giving the information. Then on second reference, you use just the last name. You always put the in. Oh, and with attribution, usually you say said, and you always write in the past tense. You always say said, or stated, or told. And the reason is you don't say says or states or writes, because by the time you have gathered that information, they've already said it, right? You've put it in print. And so they're no longer saying it, they have said it. And so we usually use the past tense in written in written format. In radio and TV, because you are making the statement for them at that time, and because you want to create a sense of urgency, a sense of current events, there they'll write in the present tense, but that's just a different style. So that's something to keep in mind as you're writing. As for this class, I'd prefer you to write in the past tense in the written format, but if your goal is to someday work and do stuff for TV or radio, then you probably kind of have to be aware of that alternative format.